We're so thrilled to have you here for our very first webinar for the Vanguard Virtual Series. We have 78 attendees joining us today, and I think that's a fantastic kickoff. Before I introduce our presenter, there's just a few housekeeping items I wanted to share with you. Because of the large number of attendees, the session is presented as a webinar. It's unlike a Zoom. You will not be able to see your fellow attendees, but trust me, they're all here. The webinar is presented just as if Professor Mackey was teaching one of his classes. So this will kind of give you a firsthand experience with how our students are learning virtually. Questions are certainly welcome, and you can participate in a couple of ways. First, please take a look at the bottom of your screen and find the chat icon. And when you have a question, simply type into the chat room and we will acknowledge your question near the end of the presentation. And you can also click on the hand raised icon if you have a question, and our technical host will unmute you so that you can ask your question in real time. I forgot to introduce myself. I feel like I know so many of you already. My name's Mary Landers, and I have the pleasure of serving as the Director of Alumni Engagement at UNCG, and I welcome you. And now I am proud to present our presenter today, Professor Wade Maki. Professor Maki's session is a command performance. He's presented to members of the Vanguard a couple of times and was so well received, his presentation was requested to kick off this virtual series. Professor Mackey is a senior lecturer. He earned his MA at Bowling Green State University in 1998, and his research interests are applied ethics and political philosophy. Wade teaches a variety of courses in philosophy and for the Bachelor of Liberal Studies program, with topics ranging from business ethics to the meaning of life. And Wade, I can't wait to hear you talk about that. Wade is known for his innovative use of technology in both classroom and online courses. In addition to teaching, Wade has served the university in many roles, including director of the BB&T program on capitalism, markets, and morality, co-director of the Faculty Teaching and Learning Commons, faculty fellow for online learning. And he also serves on Faculty Senate and numerous other university committees. Having grown up in northern Minnesota, where the growing season is extremely short, Wade has taken to southern gardening. He's attracted to the zen of Asian gardens, and Wade's yard is full of Japanese maples, conifers, Asian statuary, and numerous Japanese lanterns. He also grows vegetables, fruits, and herbs, including the Stokes purple sweet potato. Wade also enjoys most things involving technology and history. So with that brief introduction, and without further ado, I am pleased to introduce Professor Wade Maki. Thank you, Wade. Can't wait to hear from you.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. And welcome to all of you out there. I have this sort of Pink Floyd lyric in my mind about, is there anybody out there? Because I can't see you, but do pose questions along the way. So I'm really excited about this talk. It's sort of a jumping off of a talk I gave early in the year, pre-COVID, around similar themes, and the response was so good that I wanted to sort of expand on it. I got so excited doing it that I ended up having far more slides and far more things to tell you than I could possibly fit into the time allotted, while also giving you a chance to ask questions. So I'm going to just converse a bit, and rather than show you any slides, I'm just going to change backgrounds along the way. And if you have a question about something I'm saying, please pose it. Otherwise, you can hold them for the end, and we'll just go into more detail into the areas that interest you. To begin with, we have this wonderful building behind me. This is Faust. Sort of in the beginning, there was Faust. And what's interesting to me about this particular building is it really signifies sort of the first generation of the university, and probably the first, second, and third generation of the university. In that we don't build buildings quite like this anymore. This building wasn't built out of pure practicality. When you look at it, it has features hearkening all the way back to sort of medieval eras. I mean, you don't need the rounded windows and the balconies and the arched doorways, the towers. we were really signifying something, that this place is special. It is well crafted, highly detailed, because when we look at that early generation of students, we can see some similarities. And when I say that, when we look at the early generations that attended college, we know a lot about them. And most importantly, they knew that college was rare. Most people did not go to college. Most men did not go to college, and very, very few women did go to college. So if you were one of those students, we know a couple of things about you. One, you were very, very gifted, and or very, had a family that was very, very well connected, often both, in order to go to college. You, as a college student in that era, would have known this was a life-changing opportunity because so few people had it. So this is a generation of people that really came from the best of the best just to even get in. Now, this is a photo from 1900. These are the Naughty Knots. This is the first basketball team at the institution. They're holding the ball and they're standing outside of Faust here. I love this photo for a number of reasons. It shows just how small the institution was. And it speaks to this idea that these students really were facing a lot of different challenges that we didn't have. One challenge, they played apparently in the full dress skirts. Now, if you can imagine our men's team trying to play basketball in full skirt, I'd actually like to see that. But in this era, these students really had a lot to look forward to coming to the institution. As I break things down, I have found a wealth of information from a library site. The library has a timeline site where you can look year by year as to what happened at the university. And so I was looking at some of sort of the earlier things that were going on. And in the era that these students would have been, and even for many decades afterwards, the university, because they were dealing with these sort of elite young people, the university didn't really have to support them. Because the big theme of today, or a big theme, is not just that students evolve, but that the university evolves to meet the needs of the students that it's bringing in. And so in an era where the students were themselves so well prepared and so well supported, that what the university did was provide paternalism. So in these early decades of the university, the students had to sign in and out of the dormitories. They had to have permission to ride in cars. They had mandatory physical education classes because the university's mission was to take these students and make sure that they don't get into trouble, to sort of monitor them for that, and then just be paternalistic for their own good, to ensure that they didn't cause any trouble and that they were better people at the end of the day. And this may not be clear as to why that's significant until we get to later in the talk, but it's a really significant difference. When I look at what happened in this era, some dates that jumped out at me. In 1923, there were over 100 degrees awarded. Now think of what that means. How few students went to college? Well, we had only 100 degrees awarded in 1923. In 1932, this was an interesting tidbit to me, the smoking ban was lifted so students could smoke in the dorms. History may not always repeat itself, but it certainly rhymes. And we can't imagine today sort of authorizing students to smoke in dorms. But there was a time when they couldn't, then there was a time they could, and now we're back to this is not a good idea. In 1938, enrollment hit 2,000. I love that number because that is exactly 10% of where we are today. So when you look at even in the 30s, we're only 1/10 the size of an institution. What were sort of the events of the period? I found one that jumped out at me I wanted to share, and that was in 1954, there was a literary magazine scandal at the university, where the literary magazine had published a pen and ink drawing of a nude male. And as a result of that, the chancellor censured the publication, and the staff resigned in protest, and faculty resigned positions advising the group, and so forth, all over a nude drawing in a publication. Can't even imagine our students today even understanding why that was an issue. But things were so different in that era that even something that minor was a big stir. What do we know about what we'll call that sort of those early generations that attended college? Success, or what we could call survival, often required resilience or grit. Not everyone likes those terms, but what we mean by them is simply this, that to succeed, you had to really do a lot on your own. There wasn't a lot of support services from the institution. The institution was there to make sure you didn't cause any trouble. It wasn't necessarily to make sure you succeed. A lot of the faculty attitudes were that they were supposed to be hard on you and weed you out if you didn't belong. So those early generations really had to get through on their own, or they had to have pre-built outside of campus support networks that could help them be successful. If we talk about their generational ethic, it might be something like hard work, a belief in duty, as many of them believed they had a duty to succeed in college because their families had done so much to get them that opportunity to come to college. And they valued overcoming struggle, right? And this sort of shapes their whole worldview. Moving on, because once you get ahead a few decades, I have a photo. You may remember this building, recently deceased, the Mckeever Building. This is 1960, right? So sort of we jump ahead, we say we transition into sort of the early or just before the baby boomers arrive, when campuses had to grow and expand because, of course, there was a much larger generation about to come to college. And this building is interesting to me because compared to Faust, where's the love in the design here? It's, these clean lines and not a whole lot of things adorning it, just very basic, except for these, odd little squares and rectangles on the front, right? But that sort of is a reflection of sort of the shift from we're trying to project this sort of elite special nature to now these big utilitarian kinds of boxes. And what do we know about the boomers? Just some general traits. And again, when I talk about generational traits, we're simply talking about trends, right? Something might be more prevalent by a third in one group than another. It doesn't mean everyone or no one has it. But generally speaking, boomers were more likely to have a stable home life with two parents who had defined roles. Often one parent was at home when they came back from school. Very few went to college, but a lot of them were encouraged to go. Going was seen as an accomplishment in and of itself. Some of the things that happened on campus during this period included the ban of communist speakers, or ban of speakers who were claimed to be communists, desegregation in 1956, co-education. Our students at UNCG participated in sit-ins, and of course the Vietnam War, which is not insignificant because a lot more people went to college because of the Vietnam War, as it was a way of not having to go into the draft pool. Things that happened, in 1960, our students participated in Woolworth sit-ins, even though the name of UNCG was formalized in 1963. Also in 1963, the campus police gained the power to arrest people. That's sort of another historical oddball that students today would have a hard time. Why would you have police that couldn't arrest people? In 1964, we had 282 men enroll and 500 degrees were awarded. Now, think about that, right? So we went from 100 degrees in the 20s to 500 degrees in the 60s. This massive growth. Again, this can be a theme of the talk. And in 1966, when we talked about the sort of paternalism of the early years, we saw the end of the skirt and dress code for women. That was finally abolished, but it lasted until 1966. This would be sort of unheard of today to even speak about a dress code really for anyone. But again, that was that legacy of you were treated as something to be paternalized and controlled. And the baby boomers were this generation that says, we want freedom. We want people to be able to do what we want to do. Also, this is 1970, right? So again, still in sort of the baby boomer era, but this is Graham, which sort of opened in 1970. And I love this one because this is, you couldn't get closer to a literal brick box than this design, because universities were seeing this sort of expansion of students. So it was, we need space, we need it now, and we've got to build it quick, and we don't have time to make it look all pretty. Let's just get it up there for those students. And again, this was just one building, but it represents campuses and changes all over the country. As this building was 1970, some things that happened in that next decade. There was the first documented case of streaking on campus in 1974. That just jumped out at me for a couple of reasons. One being that I wouldn't recommend trying it today. We have cameras everywhere. There were anti-Nixon rallies on campus. Physical education, that requirement was dropped in 1978. Again, that move away from just requiring things because they were good for you. And by 1980, enrollment hit 10,000 students. So we were half the size we were today. Talking a little more about baby boomers, what made them really interesting was they had a common frame for viewing the world. What I mean by that, they had 3 TV networks. They pretty much all got the same sort of news, no matter which channel they went to. They saw pretty much the same set of movies, had of limited access to local radio stations. And there was sort of a common religious language that people would use to sort of talk about ethics and morality and things. So they really had a lot of common features and common experience as a generation. Their generation ethics seems to be, give us free speech we value, give us personal freedom, treat us like adults, and treat us all equally, right? That's sort of what they pushed for in their time with us. Now, moving forward, I have this building. And this is an exciting building. It is a parking deck, Walker parking deck from 1994. So the next generation to come through is called Generation X. It's a group to which I am a member, but this reflects one of these incremental changes. We were building parking decks because unlike the days when you had to have permission to go in a car, by the time you got to Gen X, you could expect every kid coming to college came with a car. Why is that significant? Because the university had to provide the infrastructure, and that means spending money, and that means raising costs on students to provide the infrastructure for parking and other things. This, again, is going to be a theme we're going to see. When we think of Generation X, we should be aware of a few differences from their parents and their children. One, in Generation X, many kids went to college. Define the years, the boomers, Gen X. In general, I actually have that here. This is sort of the way that they generally do it. I didn't make this up. I took this from elsewhere. Pre-1945, they call the traditionalists or the silent generation. Baby boomers are those primarily born between 1946 and 64. Gen Xers between 1965 and 76. Millennials, I'll be getting to them next, or Generation Y, born between 1977 and 95, the idea being they sort of came of age in the early part of the new millennium. And then the last group I'll talk about is what they call Generation Z, sometimes referred to as I generation, like iPhone, and they were those born after 1996. So thank you for that question. Getting back to talking a little bit about Gen X. They were expected to go to college, in large part because a lot of the jobs where you had whole families where the one parent did the same job as a child and so forth for a couple of generations. If you remember the sort of the 80s and the 90s, that was a time where kids kind of knew those factory jobs, those are gone. The careers that most of your parents had are going away. They're sort of leaving, going to other countries. And so kids, more of that generation was sort of told, you'd better go to college because that's going to be the only way you're going to support yourself. But it's important to understand this generation's mindset because they tended to come from more dysfunctional homes than previous generation. Now, part of that is, if you go back to the 70s and the 60s and you talk about more freedom, more personal freedom, sexual revolution, women's liberation, one of the consequences of that was you had a lot more unmarried parents, out of wedlock children, the divorce rate was higher, you had two-parent working families, these were all trends, but the result was a lot more what we would call dysfunctional families. And Generation X had a higher likelihood that those kids, when they came home from school, were alone. The phrase that's thrown around often is latchkey kids, and anybody of that age will remember that phrase, latchkey kids, that you had to have your own key to get home, get in the house, because your parents were pretty much unreachable. They were likely at work. This generation will actually, some of them will remember rotary phones or party lines, but they certainly didn't have cell phones until they were pretty much working adults. They played a lot outside as kids, but interestingly enough, by the time they got to college, the personal computer revolution was happening. So Gen X was the first generation to really get access to technology when they were young, but technology didn't work. If you can remember trying to install a printer in 1990, you couldn't just plug it in and think it was going to work. Everything was trial and error and required troubleshooting. This was also an interesting feature of this generation in Gen X was they were exposed to the past through mass media in a way that no generation has since. What do I mean by that? I was born in 1973, so I'm firmly in the Gen X group. However, I saw all of the shows from the 50s and 60s, Gilligan's Island and so forth, because if you had more than 4 channels, you had basic cable, and basic cable mostly was showing reruns most of the time. So you got to see decades past movies, documentaries, because that was all that was on. In future generations, there's so much new content that they don't have that sort of common frame. As this generation was a lot of the times left alone to themselves, they had to learn to solve their own problems, including problems with technology. Some things that occurred in this era. In 1987, the color navy was added to the gold and white. Home economics was sort of renamed. So again, you have sort of these cultural changes about what we call things, and sort of updating our language began. In 1990, there was sort of a bit of a scandal. The Board of Trustees and the Chancellor had to put out statements defending animal research at UNCG because this was a common issue, this sort of animal rights issue coming out in the early 90s. 1991, the university reached Division I athletics. That was a multi-year effort, but it was a big change. And in 1992, we opened an 87,000 square foot rec center. And this is another thing I want to point out to you, that in addition to parking decks, students coming to college, because there were more of them, they expected more amenities. Right? They weren't allowed to just use the same gyms as the Division I athletes were using. Those were reserved for the sports teams. And so the university was expected to provide more amenities, which are also done, and this has gone on till this day, because students and parents visiting campus can't tell by looking around how great the faculty are, but they can certainly tell how great the amenities are, the dining, the food options, the exercise facilities. And so those became real drivers of whether students came to college. So if we look at some of the big issues of Generation X's time at the university, you would see first a tolerance of moving to an acceptance of gay rights. So sort of animal rights, gay rights, these were big movements in this time period. This was also the last generation to really look at finding faculty during their office hours, where you'd have to look up where they were and then plan your question and go and be there at a certain time. Nowadays, they all have email or text. The ethics of the Generation X could probably best be described as continuing like the baby boomers, free speech. They had a real ethic of leave us alone and leave other people alone. That sort of ties into the gay rights theme. Why are you bothering people who just want to be left alone? And why was it sort of a generational ethic? Because so many of them had always been alone doing their own thing. Why change it now? So moving on. When you look at millennials, the thing to know about millennials is there was the baby boom, that was a big generation, and the millennials are sort of the echo of that, right? Sort of that big generation, this was their kids. And so we have this giant influx of students, but also with each of these generations, you'll notice more and more of them are actually coming to college. And so the university had to plan and expand for that. So here, this is the Sullivan Science Building. This was 2003, very large, wonderful facility that was built. In 2006, we added the Gatewood Arts Studio, another great building to visit and get a tour of. That fourth floor has some beautiful views up there, and those kids up there doing their design project, interior architecture, wonderful work. And of course, the new More Humanities building, also in 2006, because there was going to be this giant wave of both there are more potential college students, and they all know that college is where they need to be. What do we know about millennials? They've pretty much always had access to cell phones and the internet. Gen X got those things as they became adults, but the millennials always had them. Technology for them, they were always users of technology, because technology always worked, right? Many touch screens, they pretty much worked, or you could go to a store and there was a genius or somebody to help you with them. This generation, though, one big difference from Gen X is they often are described as having a helicopter or a snowplow parent. Both of those are slightly different. A helicopter parent is the one that hovers along with them through issues. And so it is in the time when millennials come to campus that faculty will start to see, this isn't that common, but just started to see kids wanting to talk to you about their grades and showing up to your office with their parents. The snowplow parent, of course, is the one who goes ahead of the child and tries to clear all obstacles out from in front of them before they get there. And so you have this generation has a cell phone, they have instant access to their parents at all times. Their parents are always there helping them solve problems. And part of it is because a lot of those parents were the kids that were left home alone in the prior generation and really resented being left alone. And in terms of faculty, these kids always had email. So they simply would sit down, something happens, something bothers them. They would fire off an email to a faculty member, sometimes 2 or 3 emails in 10 minutes. And the last one often said, I understand, I figured it out, never mind. But there's sort of this generational instant access, expecting an instant response from faculty. Looking forward, things that happened really continue the expansion of campus. In 1997, a 7,200 square foot super lab was opened in the library, because now colleges had to provide technology. And that expands even further with wireless internet everywhere on campus. But we had to provide computer access and softwares to run it, and training and staff to support it. Again, wonderful for students, but it's another thing raising the cost of education. And it's an expectation that we would have that. By 2005, enrollment hit 16,000 students. Moving on a little further, you see whole new subject matters created. This, of course, is our joint nanoscience, nanoengineering school with North Carolina A&T State University, 2007. Again, these are supporting jobs and careers and majors that did not exist before, as universities had to expand to keep up with things. I mean, we still keep our philosophy and classics department, right? Very few departments go away, they evolve, and others are created. The university continues to grow to meet those students' needs. This is a climbing wall, and it runs all 3 levels of the Kaplan Center for Wellness, because even though we had in the early 90s, we built a rec center, by the time the millennials came, we needed a larger and even better rec center. And this one cost $91 million, but boy, is it great. Parents and kids, when they see it, they just say, I want to come to school here because I love the 3-story climbing wall. Or here's just an image of some of the exercise equipment that they have access to over there. I highly suggest you take a tour sometime just to see it. But this goes to show this sort of this arms race in higher education of having to expand more and more things because the parents expect it, the kids expect it, and the universities have to meet them where they're at, or they choose to go somewhere else. This is not to say that it was universally loved. Here's another photo from the time period. What is it? Education over recreation, for example. This was a protest of students who didn't want to see their tuition costs and education costs go up to have a rec center. Although the place is always full now that it's built. But this is the tension we have. Students' costs of education have risen dramatically, and they know that, and it bothers them, and yet everything it's being spent on is something that they themselves want to have around and sort of have come to demand. And this is the bind the university is in. Moving onward. Talking back a little more about millennials. One of the attitudes you start to get is this idea of I'm the customer, right? Because college is sort of expected. It's expected that I'm here. Faculty are here to help me, just like my parents are here to help me. And I expect everyone, staff at the university, to help me solve problems, because their whole lives have been sort of group attempts to solve problems, instant access to calling parents, seeking help. They have very little exposure to old mass media. Again, there's so much new content for them to view. It becomes very hard for people like me to come up with a cultural example from a movie or something, because so few of them would know anything I would pick. Their generational ethics, though, because of all this interconnectivity, they're much more connected to the community. They value not national community, but sort of global humanity. So they're really into their local community and human rights in general. They have far less tolerance for something called, what would be called hate speech. They're not very tolerant of things that offend people, because of course, part of that is being part of a community is you shouldn't do things that offend others. Again, that's just a trend that you find in this generation, different from previous generations. Moving onward, let's see, what do we got next? And we're still growing, right? Here we are, 2020, brand new nursing building, almost complete. It looks to be phenomenal, as here we have 20,000 students in 2019. So we are 10 times larger, because in this generation, most of them are expected to go to college. Now, 2020 became a very strange year because we had a pandemic requiring remote instruction and what I call the new abnormal. Now, the next generation to arrive is what we call, what we call Gen Z or iGen. Oops, I went forward a few too many photos. And the thing for you to know about them is if they're coming to school now as sort of a first year student, they have no memory of 9/11, right? That they were born after that. They have a few memories of the Obama years when they were very young, and not much before that. Their whole life, this country has been involved in military conflicts in the Middle East. They have so much focus, so many options for streaming services, every bit of music, movies out there, that there's very few common cultural touchstones. So there's very few points of reference for movies or music that they all know. This is also the No Child Left Behind generation. So their entire K through 12 educational experience involved being taught to the test. So it was very different than previous generations. They're used to using technology everywhere. They always have. And they often feel that you're violating their rights if you tell them to sort of put down the phone or don't use a laptop. I even see them on their phones when crossing the street. They go right in the crosswalk. If somebody else is they'll just follow them along. It's not safe, but that's just sort of how they've all grown up. One anecdote on this. In fall of 2019, I had an honors student who was shocked when I mentioned that there were two Germanys and they had been split up after the Second World War and only reunited with the fall of the Berlin Wall. This student had never heard this story and wanted me to tell them all about it. Now, I don't tell you this to fault the student. I tell you this because this something wasn't part of their K-12 education. And unlike someone in my era who would have just seen a documentary because it was the only thing on television that wasn't a game show or a soap opera, this student just hadn't encountered it in mass media and didn't know that. Looking at some of the things on campus. These are sleep pods. right? So you actually lay in here, and then it wraps around you, and it sort of vibrates, sort of a massage thing. It sort of, sonically blocks out other noise, puts on relaxing music, etc. And it's so that you can sleep in. This is actually in the Kaplan Center for Wellness. Again, an example of how college has changed, but it's a change that students expect. I actually saw a tweet just today where somebody said, "Hey, where are the sleep pods at?" Because a student was looking for them, because these are sort of amenities that they have come to expect. Here's another one about the change. I love this photo because, let me go this side. These two gentlemen are both on electric scooters, and you see these everywhere on campus today. They simply swipe their credit card and they get to zip around campus on scooters. But one of the reasons, there's two reasons I love this particular photo that I found. One is they're using two competing brands of scooters, because scooters are that much of a demand that there are two companies providing them. And the other is, if you look back over here, those are the bicycle racks across the street, completely empty, because scooters are so popular for these kids. Saying a little bit more about this generation of students today, a lot of them, almost all of them, are encountering online learning, and that's even pre-pandemic. Some of them are only online learners. For fun, every year we get notified they play Humans versus Zombies, which is sort of a tag game where they have their Nerf guns, and we're all warned like nothing bad is happening. This game goes on for a whole week. These kids have a very, very high expectations for success, both academically, their own success. They expect a very good life. They expect to be praised regularly. They expect to be rewarded quickly. This again fits into sort of the whole time that they've been raised, what they've experienced. And that's one of the reasons why they're struggling so much now, that universities are in this COVID crisis, and it's not meeting their expectations. Some of the big issues of today that this generation is facing now is transgender and non-binary rights. Those are sort of very common campus discussions going on. This is a generation that always was able to Google the answer, right? There was always a device or the internet to tell them things. They've always been told they were unique and special. And this is in part because where older generations will remember being told, you're not special, we're being told, look to the left, look to the right, one of those students isn't going to be here anymore. That line of thinking is no longer the way education operates. Students are instead encouraged positively, if you can do it, you're great. And so they've come to inculcate that in their worldview. They view college often as a right, that everyone has the right to go to college, and more go than ever. Their generational ethics tend to be, rather than talking about things in religious language, they talk about social justice, diversity, and equity. They love supporting and comforting environments. And they use that language a lot about, I don't feel supported or cared about. They believe in helping the least well-off among them first. And rather than just say treat everyone equally, they have a tendency to want to be treated based on their individual or group identity preferences. So don't treat us the same, treat us like this type of person wants to be treated. And that may be different from other groups. Some facts about the students of 2020, as I sort of wind down. We have increased diversity. Primarily racial diversity, but international diversity, other forms as well. Students are more likely to be from working class families. They're more likely to be workers themselves, more likely to have children than ever before, and they're more likely to be first generation college students. This is significant because each of these groups has special needs if we want them to succeed, that the university needs to provide more support staff than ever before. Think of first generation students. If no one in your family has ever come to college, what is a registrar and how do things work? And if you don't have that knowledge, the university has to provide people to help you navigate those systems. So there's been a lot of different changes going on. And I want to show you a couple of more photos. This one I think is interesting because this was our last mascot, right? But one of the things that we did is we realized, he looks really white. And a lot of our students aren't white. And some people feel that there's a message being sent there. And, so one of the things we did, and this was a lot of work, here's our new mascot, right? And here you'll notice he's just blue and gold, and he could be anybody under that. And sort of this being sensitive to these kinds of things is sort of an expectation to meet what these students and their parents expect from us. Things are going really well in some fronts. This is where the Spartan men play basketball. As you can see, we get a lot more than what the Naughty Knots would have had in 1900, as the university is larger than ever. We have a whole lot of additional challenges that we never had before. And I want to give you what I think is the biggest one. I mean, there are many, but we'll see what comes up in the Q&A afterwards. The university, because we have so many different kinds of students, because so many students attend college that would have never made it to college. I mean, if you were a working single parent 40 years ago, you probably just couldn't succeed at college and couldn't afford it on your own and wouldn't have been supported. Now those folks are coming to college because it's the only real path to a career, or the best path that they have. But one of the things that comes with that is the mental health crisis, and I don't use that word as an exaggeration. According to our own student affairs folks, over 40% of UNCG students have a diagnosed mental health issue. And that's not the wrong number, 40%, the nationwide, right? 40%, it's over 40. But of course, that includes minor things like maybe they have ADHD, or maybe they have, stress or anxiety, but often more serious things too. The point is that as an institution, in order to serve those students and to not lock them out of access to higher education and all of the career options that come with that, the institution needs to hire more counselors, more support staff. They have to train us. So faculty are now expected to do mental health training. We're to help track the students and refer any issues we detect from them to the appropriate, the Dean of Students office, to make sure those students are given access to the resources of the university to support them. And there's a lot of infrastructure and people and jobs involved in that. Again, raising the cost of education, essential though, if you want to actually include everyone in that education. We've seen a rise in emotional support, or what they call comfort animals. So students that they have medical reasons why they need a pet with them to sort of get over their anxiety. What causes all of this? Well, one thing to note is a lot of this has always been there. It's just a whole lot of people never went to college in previous generations, going all the way back. If you were the best of the best, coming from a well-connected family, you didn't have a lot of these problems. The people who did have these issues often didn't get in. And now we're getting them in. And that, though, involves doing a lot more support for them. But social media is also a part of it, because these kids grew up with social media. All their friends are there. And there's this weird effect. When you look at social media, if you look up me on any social media, Facebook, Twitter, what have you, you'd think my life is all about puppies and gardens and pretty pictures and happy talks like this one. And you wouldn't see that, I have bad days too. But these kids see all of their peers all of the time, and they only see them having these wonderful experiences because that's what they're sharing. They can see their photos, which have been digitally edited to make them look great. And these kids suffer a lot from my life isn't going as well as I see on social media. Everyone else's life seems to be going. So we've come a long way. We've come from mandatory physical education in Coleman to sleep pods in Kaplan. We went from 2 dining options to having dozens of dining options, including allergy-free dining spaces, because there's a lot of students with allergies. We went from home economics to nanoscience, intercollegiate athletics to Division I, NCAA. The university has changed a lot. I'll bring us back to Faust, which is still here, still looking great. We've in some ways gone from paternalism to freedom and slightly back again. But UNCG has more students than ever. We have more success than ever. We graduate more students at a higher rate than before. We've closed the racial education gap. We, along the way, have increased compliance costs from federal regulations, state regulations, creditor regulations. We require many more student support services. The expectations from all of the stakeholders, including parents, are far higher than ever before in terms of student safety, the need for a fully functional health center and police to keep everybody safe. And everything we do is beneficial and probably even essential, but they're also expensive. And so I will bring us back to where we started. We are 10 times larger than we started and still going strong. And we appreciate your continual involvement and support. So let's take some questions. Would you say that your description of the UNCG community is similar or different from the other 16 branches of the university system? Excellent question. So first and foremost, the mental health issue is nationwide. And for those of you who remember our previous president, Margaret Spellings of the system, she was touring and came to Greensboro, and she was asked by several representatives from several campuses, what are you going to do for mental health? Because this is all over the place. I serve in the faculty assembly. That's not the local group, that's the system group. And we have a whole committee just looking at student mental health, because this is a new one. I mean, when I started teaching, no one came up to me and said, I'm off my meds. But I get that question now, or I'm not that kind of a doctor. But this sort of students with mental health issues need support. But even on other issues, UNCG is different only in that we have more first-generation students and greater racial diversity than the non-HBCUs. So the students at Chapel Hill, of course, come from different socioeconomic backgrounds, but the central problems, the need to provide all of the services are still there. They're just in different degrees. If we have, it's because we serve the students that we do, as our chancellor says, we make a difference of trajectory. We take students from here to here, where they go to Duke, they go from here to here. We make that huge difference, but because our students are starting sometimes a little less prepared than some of the students at the flagship school, we have additional obligations to them that come with additional costs. I hope that answered the question. Other questions?
Wade, there's one that I received beforehand, and it is, do you think students today find the same type of loyalty and devotion to their alma mater that exists with older alumni?
Well, that's a very interesting question, because even amongst alumni, there are different eras, right? And when you look at different eras, people felt different sorts of connections to the university. Right now, I mean, if you come to campus, and sadly, this is not the fall to do it, but we've been doing this thing called Navigate, which is sort of a whole day orientation on the first day of classes. And you see every student wearing a UNCG t-shirt from the school that they're in. And it's not just that day. When you come to events and walk around campus, you see UNCG hats and gear and shirts all over these kids, in a way that when I came here, and I've been here since 2004, and I think the old joke was that UNCG hats were like the 8th most worn university hat on campus, because a lot of the students just didn't feel that sense of connection decades ago. That right now, we've had real momentum, and there's a real identity that has grown up with the athletics rebranding, with just sort of getting what we used to call the hidden gem of UNCG out there, that these kids are really happy. And just to give you a side story, in the summers, one of the things I've been involved in is something called UNCG Chance, which is a camp for high school juniors and seniors of the Latino background, who are often from families who maybe the parents don't speak English and have not gone to college, but they come spend a week with us and just learn about how do you apply to college, what is college, what are the major options, because their families just don't often have the background knowledge to sort of give these kids that sort of chance for how they could change their life trajectory. And we've been doing that for a few years. It's a small group, just 100 students a summer, But some of those students have come here and are now graduating, and they are fanatically loyal to this institution because this institution takes the time to do outreach to different kinds of students. I'm just giving you one example with one group of students, and says, we want to help you, whether you come here or not. And those kids just love the place. And I don't think that they're going to forget us anytime soon. We're not just another state university in Greensboro anymore. I see a question. How do you foresee our education system addressing the mental health issues, and should there be an intervention earlier? Great question. And I'm, as a philosophy faculty, I'm probably not the best guy to answer it, but I can tell you a couple things that I have heard people who know more than I do say. One of the issues with mental health is that oftentimes it's during the college age range that mental health issues first appear. Right? So it's often, some things they can detect when they're in high school, but some things only arise when students come to college. And keep in mind, when they come to college, that's the first time that they're not living at home. That's the first time they're encountering all of the stresses of trying to solve all of these problems that they didn't have before without just mom and dad being right there. So the mental health issue is a real challenge because it really, explodes, erupts, it manifests itself when they're with us. And what we really need is a lot more resources. And we can't have enough counselors around to meet the demands of the students that come in. But there are people who are far better qualified to say much more than that. But it's a challenge that's going to require the resource support and probably some intervention where possible, and a lot more education. I mean, as a faculty member, I was taught how to teach philosophy. I wasn't taught how do I deal with a student who seems to be having a crisis. And when I started teaching in the late 90s, the attitude would have been, that's not your problem. But the culture of the university has had to change to meet the needs of these students. So mental health is everybody's responsibility. And so faculty are still learning, how do you address it? I hope that was a good answer. Next question, how do you keep educational content universally high if you are taking students who are not prepared? Excellent question. So it's not about lowering the endpoint, right? It's about scaffolding the path to that endpoint. Meaning, once you recognize that certain groups of students may not be as prepared, you have to sort of lower something to where they're at to meet them, and then put them on a really sharp upswing to get them where you want. And so you look at something like the math department, and I'm not an expert on this, but they've done, and I'm going to blank on the name of it now, but they have a whole new math initiative, system-wide, designed to address the math shortfalls. Because the old way of doing this was we would simply say, oh, well, you didn't test well in math, go take remedial math. But what we learned is the kids who were taking remedial math then never caught up, right? They started behind and they stayed behind, and it really wasn't successful. And so now they're having them do things like, and I'm not an expert to describe their project, but they'll take sort of a remedial course at the same time that they're in the course they should be to make it to the end point. So they're sort of doing them in tandem. And these are specially designed to work with each other to help get those kids caught up. So that's sort of an example of the approach that's being taken. Let's see, another question. Sorry, I missed the beginning of your wonderful talk. If you did cover this, I didn't cover it yet. How are you measuring your success rate of graduates against other branches of UNC? I'll tell you what I would love to do. What I would love to see us do is just sort of get these students on film when they come to us, and just have them talk about things that they know, and then film them again, sort of a mini 5-minute interview when they're seniors. And what you would, I think, see is that it was such a vast gap between where they started and where they left. And I think if you looked at other schools, right, some of the flagship schools, those kids may leave it, they all leave really well, but they actually started really well. So when I talk about it, it's the trajectory, to again quote the chancellor. It's where they started from and where you get them to. But if you look at our students, where they go, how many of them end up doing wonderful things in the arts and the sciences. For a school our size, with the students from the socioeconomic backgrounds that we get, we punch above our weight class. And I think there's people, again, the student success folks could better give you data to answer that question. But I hope I did a fair job of it.
Wade, I had another question emailed to me, and the question is, what do you find to be one of the strong qualities of students today?
Oh, that's a great one. Strong qualities. They are really good about speaking up for themselves. And I don't mean necessarily to you. I mean, you know, there's sort of a history of people who, you know, aren't treated right and they're quiet about it. These kids will not be quiet. If there's something that they're not getting what they need or what they want, they're going to tell somebody. Sort of, again, unlike people of my generation who it was up to you to figure it out. And if you couldn't figure it out, just deal with it. These kids come in and they know that this place is supposed to help them. And if they're not getting the help they want, they're going to try getting it from somewhere else. And that goes a long way to making sure that they do get some of the help that they need. Other questions? Oh, the other part of that answer I'll give is this. They really have high hopes and expectations, right? They are driven. Like, they know, I'm going to be whatever it is I want to be. I'm going to be an entrepreneur and do all of this stuff. These kids come to college with really big dreams in a way that I don't think previous generations always did. Let's see. Another question. I was struck by your discussion on students today not having the prior generational touchstones. How do we give them a bridge to other generations? That's a great question. I wish I knew the answer to that. What I want to say is, you know, this has to be more in education. I think if you look at the actual amount of history and, you know, government education, you know, how government works that they get, it's not as much as it used to be. They're not getting all of that in K through 12. And then when they come to college, there's so many things for them to learn. We teach less of, we require less of those subjects than we used to. I would like to see us have more of sort of, what does it mean to be an American citizen? What is the history of sort of civil rights and law, and what, you know, why are things the way they are? Sort of basic understanding of economics. But we're up against this sort of, there's so many classes they need to take for majors, and there's so many other things we want them to know, that those things just haven't been, those sort of cultural touchstones haven't been as big of a priority. I wish we could make them. I think K through 12 also has a role. I see another question here. I'm seeing the mental health issues with my grandchildren and friends now in college. Is there any link established with Cone hospitals where students may seek help or be guided? Also, I left some comments on chat which do show we in the early 60s were not quite as archaic as the description. Oh, I didn't mean to describe anyone as archaic. I think people were quite fun. So happy to chat with you more on about what I meant there. But in terms of Cone Health, I don't know specifically what we do with Cone Health around mental health, because here's the other part of the mental health piece. You know, we're not really, we don't really know what's being done there, because we have to protect all of the privacy of all of the students. And so one of the other challenges is if you're a faculty member like myself, if I know a student's having an issue, I'm supposed to report it, but the university isn't allowed to tell me anything about what happens as a result. And again, that's that sort of balance between privacy and so forth. But I'd love to know more about how I may have misdescribed people in the early 60s, because I think baby boomers were great and a lot of fun. But of course, I'm a Gen Xer, so other than being left home alone by my baby boomer parents, things were great. Other questions?
I have my hand raised.
Brenda.
Hi. I'm a graduate from '63, and I have to tell you, in a lot of ways, I'm not sure that things have improved a lot since then. But I was wondering if the students are not prepared to come to college, is it really the college's responsibility, the university's responsibility to prepare them? Aren't they? Shouldn't they be prepared for college when they come to college?
Excellent question. Yes, they should. But now, why are they coming unprepared? And I don't just want to blame K through 12, but there are issues there where they're not getting what they should from K through 12. But then the question is, what do you do about it? So you have kids that are behind. The factory jobs aren't there for them. They've gotten out of high school, and college is sort of the shot to moving up the socioeconomic ladder. If we don't help them, what happens to them? And I don't have the answer to that. It's if we don't invest in those kids now, what happens to them? What happens to their kids? What happens to their families? And I think that's the struggle. And I consider myself an older person, right? My natural inclination is to always want to say, why can't these kids pull themselves up by their bootstraps like we did? Well, where are all those gold-souled Spartans who can just solve anything? And I think a lot of the truth is those kids are still there. It's just in each generation, we bring a much larger segment of the population that never would have made it before. And we're trying as a society to get them through college because it's critical to their futures in a way that, you go back to 1963, somebody could have dropped out of college and found a perfectly good job in most any town in America. And those options aren't there. So that's not really an answer, but it's a sort of a counter question. If we don't help them, then what? But thank you for the question.
Professor Mackey, it looks like we have one more question and we've reached 3 o'clock. So if you have time, we'll answer this last one in the chat box.
Sure. What about community colleges to help? So this is something that if you look at our UNC system, we have a new president, and the new president is actually from the community college side. I don't mean to read much into that other than to say, I think you're going to see more coordination between the universities and the community colleges going forward, where a lot of students benefit by spending their first couple of years with community colleges in programs designed to transfer them to us. My primary role these days is the director of the Liberal Studies program. That's an online degree program. And we get a lot of students that started at community college or somewhere else, and then they got to a point where they could transfer to us. So I think you will see more reliance on the community colleges, but it's not like they're full of resources either, right? So there's, as a system, we need to have both serving the students we get as first years and some students going through that route as well. And I think that's being worked on. And let me just say, I really appreciate you attending. Feel free to, drop me an email or send me other questions I can try to answer. I hope I've done okay. It's always hard answering questions live. You never know what's coming at you. Thank you, Mary.
Well, if we could give you a virtual round of applause, we will do that. And what a fascinating topic. And I know it's one that we could talk about longer. So hopefully you'll come back and join us again.
Anytime, be my honor.
I want to thank everybody again for joining us today for our inaugural session. And please send any ideas or suggestions you might have for future sessions. Just alumni@uncg.edu, or if you have my email, please reach out to me directly. Also want to remind you that our next virtual session will be on Wednesday, October 22nd. This is a different time because it's homecoming week. We are honored to have our very own Elizabeth Hudson, class of 95, editor-in-chief of Our State Magazine. She'll be joining us, and she's going to take us on a virtual trip of North Carolina featuring some of her favorite areas. And we will be partnering with some Our State audience, their travel club. So I think it's going to be a wonderful and fascinating topic. So October 22nd at 5. And then on November 10th, we have our very own Alice Irby, who I believe is in our audience today. And she will be talking about her new book. So we will be sending reminders for that as well. And also one last reminder, Homecoming and Founders Day is on Monday, October 5th. And so we hope that you'll be joining us for our virtual celebration of Founders Day. Professor Mackey, cannot thank you enough. You are just an outstanding professor, and we are so fortunate to have you as are our students. So thank you so much. And thank you everybody for attending, and please reach out. We'd love to hear from you. Have a good day.